Hello everyone, welcome to the Boring History channel. Make sure you are subscribed so our daily history reaches you without missing a single story. Tonight, we're stepping inside an ordinary home in the 1700s. But once the sun goes down, you'll discover a world that feels strangely unfamiliar. Why did families fear the night? What secrets hid in the flickering candlelight? And why would even a simple evening seem almost impossible to us today? Get comfortable, relax, and let history gently carry you back in time. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. As the sun slipped below the horizon in the 1700s, an ordinary home slowly transformed into a very different world. Without electric lights, televisions, glowing clocks, or humming appliances, evening arrived with a quiet finality that modern people rarely experience. Families watched daylight carefully, because every remaining minute of natural light was precious. The last rays shining through small windows were used to finish important work before darkness settled across the countryside or town. Curtains, if the family owned them, were pulled shut to keep out the cold and provide privacy, while shutters were secured against wind, thieves, wandering animals, or unwanted visitors. The moment daylight began to fade, everyone understood that the rhythm of the household was changing. The pace slowed, conversations became softer, and attention turned toward preparing for the long night ahead. One of the first evening tasks was creating light. This was not as simple as flipping a switch. Someone had to trim candle wicks, refill oil lamps, or prepare rushlights, made from dried rush plants dipped in animal fat. Candles were valuable possessions, especially those made from beeswax, which burned brighter and smelled better than the more common tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. Many ordinary families relied on smoky tallow candles because beeswax was expensive. The light they produced was weak, flickering, and uneven, casting moving shadows across walls and ceilings. A single candle might illuminate only a small part of the room, leaving the corners swallowed by darkness. Families learned to gather close together around whatever source of light they could afford. Every inch of candle was valuable, so people often delayed lighting them until absolutely necessary, using the last traces of twilight for as long as possible. The fireplace quickly became the heart of the evening throughout much of the year, especially during colder months. The fire never truly went out. Instead, glowing embers were carefully preserved beneath ashes overnight, so they could be revived the next morning without the difficult task of creating a completely new fire. Someone usually added fresh logs or pieces of peat, adjusted the burning wood with an iron poker, and ensured enough fuel would last through the evening. The fire provided warmth, light, and a place to cook supper all at once. Its crackling sounds filled the room while sparks occasionally floated upward into the chimney. The smell of burning oak, ash, or pine mixed with the scent of cooked food, damp clothing drying nearby, and the faint odor of smoke that seemed permanently woven into furniture, blankets, and even people's hair. Supper was often the largest meal of the day for working families. After long hours in fields, workshops, kitchens, or markets, everyone gathered around a rough wooden table. Meals depended greatly on wealth, season, and region, but many families ate thick vegetable stews, barley porridge, bread, cheese, onions, cabbage, peas, salted meat, or whatever fresh produce was available. Fresh meat was not an everyday luxury for many households. Instead, preserved foods played an important role throughout the year. The meal was eaten slowly because there were few distractions beyond conversation. There were no ringing phones, no radios, and no glowing screens demanding attention. The sounds of spoons scraping bowls, quiet laughter, children asking questions, and logs shifting in the fire formed the soundtrack of an ordinary evening. After supper, Dishes could not simply be placed into a machine for cleaning. Wooden bowls, pottery, pewter plates, and iron cooking pots were washed by hand, using warm water, ashes, sand, or homemade soap if it was available. Water itself often had to be carried from a nearby well, stream, or pump, making every bucket valuable. Nothing was wasted. Leftover food was carefully stored in cool places, covered with cloth, or placed in pantries designed to keep out insects and rodents. Breadcrumbs might be saved for future meals, while bones could later flavour another pot of soup. Household economies depended upon careful management of every resource. Evenings also offered one of the few opportunities for families simply to spend time together. Parents repaired tools, sharpened knives, carved wooden objects, or mended broken furniture, while children learned practical skills by watching closely. Women frequently spun wool into thread, knitted stockings, sewed clothing, patched worn garments, or embroidered household linens. Every stitch mattered because fabric was expensive and clothing represented months of labour. Children often learned these skills from a young age, gradually becoming useful contributors to the household, rather than simply being entertained. Even leisure activities usually involved productive work. Conversation played a much larger role than it does in many homes today. Family members discussed the day's work, upcoming harvests, market prices, weather, neighbours, local gossip, marriages, births, illnesses, and village news. Stories passed from one generation to another were repeated around the fire. Grandparents told tales about ancestors, strange travellers, local legends, mysterious creatures believed to roam nearby forests, or unusual events that had occurred decades earlier. Some stories were intended to entertain, while others taught lessons about honesty, courage, kindness, or caution. Children often listened with wide eyes as shadows danced across the walls, making every tale seem more believable. Reading during the evening depended heavily upon both literacy and wealth. Books were valuable possessions, and many ordinary homes owned only a Bible or perhaps one or two religious texts. If someone in the family could read well, they might read aloud while everyone else listened. Religious devotion was an important part of evening life in many households. Families sometimes gathered for prayers before bedtime, reading scripture or singing hymns together. These quiet moments reinforced both faith and family bonds, especially in communities where religion shaped daily routines. Children rarely stayed awake as late as modern children often do. Once darkness fully settled and household chores were completed, they were usually sent to bed. Bedrooms varied greatly according to wealth. Poorer families often shared one room, with several children sleeping together beneath blankets, stuffed with straw, feathers, wool, or dried grasses. Mattresses could be lumpy, and bed frames were sometimes simple wooden structures supported by ropes. Wealthier homes offered somewhat greater comfort, but even there bedrooms remained cold during winter, because fireplaces were usually located only in main living spaces. Bed curtains helped trap warmth and offered a small measure of privacy. Before climbing into bed, people performed simple routines that would seem unfamiliar today. Washing was often limited because heated water required considerable effort. Faces and hands might be cleaned using a basin and cloth. But full bathing was uncommon, and certainly not a nightly activity. Teeth were cleaned in various ways, sometimes using cloth, salt, herbs, charcoal, or small chewing sticks. Hair was brushed carefully, hats removed, and clothing folded for the next day's use. Night clothes, if owned, were usually plain linen garments rather than elaborate pajamas. Silence during the night was very different from modern silence. Without engines, airplanes, refrigerators, or electrical systems, natural sounds became much more noticeable. Families heard the wind moving through trees, rain striking roofs, distant church bells, marking the hours, Barking dogs, hooting owls, chirping crickets, mice scratching behind walls, horses moving in nearby stables, or the occasional footsteps of someone walking outside. Every unfamiliar sound attracted attention, because darkness concealed what could not be seen. Many people believed in ghosts, witches, spirits, or supernatural beings, making nighttime especially mysterious. Stories and beliefs often influenced how ordinary noises were interpreted. Security remained an important concern after sunset. Doors were locked using heavy wooden bars or iron locks when available. Windows were secured with shutters. In towns, night watchmen sometimes patrolled streets, calling out the hours or warning of fires in rural areas. Families depended mainly upon themselves. Dogs served as valuable protectors, barking whenever strangers approached. Fire presented one of the greatest dangers, because homes built largely from wood and thatch could burn rapidly if sparks escaped from fireplaces or candles tipped over. Before sleeping, responsible household members checked the fire carefully, extinguished unnecessary candles, and ensured embers were safely contained. Many people in the 1700s also experienced what historians call segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping continuously through the night, they often enjoyed a first sleep lasting several hours before naturally waking around midnight. During this quiet waking period, they might pray, reflect, check on animals, tend the fire, speak quietly with family members, or simply lie awake before returning to a second sleep until dawn. This pattern seemed entirely normal in many parts of Europe before artificial lighting gradually changed sleeping habits. Seasonal changes greatly influenced evening life. During summer, daylight lingered much longer, allowing additional outdoor work before darkness arrived. Families might continue harvesting, tending gardens, repairing fences, or feeding livestock. Until late evening, winter evenings, however, began surprisingly early. Darkness sometimes arrived before many tasks were finished, forcing households indoors for long stretches. After the household had settled into the quiet rhythm of the evening, there was still plenty of work that had to be done before anyone could truly rest. Tomorrow's needs always began the night before. Bread dough might be mixed and left to rise beside the warm hearth, while dried beans or peas were soaked in preparation for the next day's meal. Grain had to be protected from dampness and hungry mice, and sacks of flour were checked carefully because a single infestation could ruin weeks of precious food. Housewives often made a final inspection of the pantry, making mental notes of what supplies were running low. There were no supermarkets to visit the next morning. If the family had run out of butter, cheese, salt, or flour, replacing those items could require a long walk to the market or waiting for the next market day. Planning ahead was not simply good organization, it was necessary for survival. If the household owned livestock, evening chores continued outside even after darkness had begun to spread. Chickens were gathered safely into coops to protect them from foxes or other predators. Cows were checked one final time, horses were given water, and sheep or goats were counted to ensure none had wandered away. In farming communities, these routines were so deeply ingrained that people performed them almost without thinking. Missing even one evening check could result in an escaped animal, a damaged fence, or a predator finding an easy meal before dawn. Inside the home, clothing required constant attention. Modern fabrics are inexpensive compared to those of the 18th century, but during the 1700s every garment represented countless hours of labor. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, spun into thread, woven into cloth, cut, and sewn entirely by hand. Linen required the growing and processing of flax before it could become fabric. Because clothing demanded so much effort to produce, nothing was discarded unless it was completely beyond repair. Evenings became the perfect time for patching elbows, replacing buttons carved from bone or wood, reinforcing worn knees or turning old garments into children's clothes. A shirt might be repaired dozens of times over several years before finally becoming cleaning rags. Children often sat nearby while these tasks were performed, learning by observation rather than formal instruction. Education for ordinary families varied greatly, and many children received only basic schooling, if any at all. Instead, evenings served as an informal classroom. Boys watched fathers repair farm tools, sharpen scythes, or carve wooden handles for hammers and axes. Girls frequently learned sewing, spinning, cooking, and household management from mothers or grandmothers. Though in reality, many children learned whatever skills their family needed regardless of gender. Knowledge was passed directly from one generation to the next, through practice rather than textbooks. Older family members often occupied places closest to the fire. Age brought respect in many communities because elderly people carried memories that no written record could replace. Grandparents remembered harsh winters, poor harvests, wars, epidemics, and local events stretching back decades. They could identify changing weather simply by watching clouds or feeling the wind. Their stories connected young listeners with a past that seemed both familiar and mysterious. Long before history books became common household possessions, history itself survived through conversations held beside evening fires. Many evenings were surprisingly quiet because exhaustion settled over the household. Agricultural work demanded extraordinary physical effort. A farmer who had spent 12 hours behind a plough, harvesting grain with a sickle, or lifting heavy loads, did not possess endless energy for entertainment afterward. Hands were rough, backs were sore, and muscles ached constantly. The warmth of the fireplace often made people sleepy long before midnight. It was not unusual for someone to drift into a brief nap while sitting in a wooden chair, only to wake when another log was added to the fire, or when someone spoke their name. Visitors occasionally arrived after sunset, especially in villages where neighbours lived within walking distance. Since there were no telephones to announce a visit, a knock at the door could be either a pleasant surprise or a cause for concern. Hospitality remained an important social expectation. Guests were usually offered a place by the fire, a simple meal, if food was available, and perhaps a mug of ale, cider, or small beer. These beverages were often safer than untreated water, because the brewing process reduced harmful microorganisms. Evening visits strengthened community ties, allowed news to spread quickly, and provided welcome company during the long winter months. Games existed as well, although they looked very different from today's entertainment. Families might play simple card games, board games, dice games, riddles, or word games. If they had the time and resources, children entertained themselves with handmade toys carved from wood, rag dolls sewn from scraps of cloth, spinning tops, marbles made from clay or stone, or simple puzzles. Imagination supplied what expensive manufactured toys could not. A stick became a sword, a blanket became a castle, and shadows cast by candlelight became characters in countless invented stories. The smell inside an 18th century home would surprise most modern visitors. Even well-kept houses carried a mixture of odours that people at the time barely noticed. Smoke from the fireplace lingered constantly because chimneys were less efficient than modern designs. Animal fat candles released a distinctive scent as they burned. Fresh bread, boiling cabbage, damp wool clothing, leather boots drying beside the hearth, herbs hanging from ceiling beams, stored onions, cured meat, and occasionally livestock housed close to the family during severe winters all contributed to the atmosphere. Personal hygiene standards differed from today, not because people disliked cleanliness, but because heating large amounts of water required considerable effort. Weather shaped every evening experience. During heavy rainstorms, Water sometimes leaked through roofs despite careful maintenance. Families hurried to place buckets beneath drips while stuffing cloth into gaps around doors to keep out cold drafts. Thunderstorms frightened both children and adults because lightning frequently struck barns, churches, or trees, causing devastating fires. Many households believed ringing church bells or saying certain prayers offered protection during violent storms. Strong winds shook shutters, rattled doors, and sent smoke swirling unpredictably down chimneys, filling rooms with irritating clouds. Winter evenings were especially challenging. Frost often formed inside windows where warm indoor air met freezing outdoor temperatures. Ice occasionally appeared on water left in bowls overnight. Families huddled close together near the fire because warmth diminished rapidly just a few steps away. Bedrooms could become bitterly cold after the fire died down, making thick blankets and shared beds practical necessities rather than signs of poverty. Hot stones or heated bricks wrapped in cloth were sometimes placed beneath blankets before bedtime to make sleeping more comfortable. Summer evenings brought their own difficulties. Open windows invited mosquitoes, flies, and moths toward the candlelight. The smell of nearby farms drifted indoors, and warm temperatures sometimes spoiled food more quickly. Nevertheless, many people preferred summer because longer daylight meant fewer candles were needed, reducing household expenses. Families often remained outdoors until the last possible moment, enjoying cooler evening air after hot days spent working beneath the sun. Time itself felt different during the 18th century. Most ordinary people did not constantly check clocks because many households owned none. Church bells, sunset, sunrise, and personal routines determined the passing of hours more than precise minutes. Evening unfolded naturally rather than according to strict schedules. There was no pressure to answer late night emails, watch one more television episode, or scroll endlessly through social media. When darkness deepened and eyelids grew heavy, people simply prepared for bed. Superstitions quietly influenced many nighttime habits. Some families believed sweeping the floor after dark invited bad luck. Others avoided whistling indoors during the evening, fearing it might attract evil spirits or misfortune. Strange knocks, unexplained footsteps, or unusual animal sounds outside the house were often interpreted through the lens of local folklore. Owls, black dogs, ravens, or flickering candle flames sometimes carried symbolic meanings that varied from one region to another. While educated scholars increasingly embraced scientific thinking during the 18th century, ordinary rural communities frequently blended practical knowledge with long-held traditional beliefs. Letters occasionally transformed an otherwise ordinary evening. Since postal services operated slowly, receiving a letter from a distant relative or friend was an important event. If only one family member could read, everyone gathered around as the letter was read aloud by candlelight. News of births, deaths, marriages, military service, business opportunities, or family hardships traveled across weeks or even months before reaching its destination. Every letter was treasured, folded carefully, and often reread many times over the years. Illness also changed the atmosphere of an evening. Without modern hospitals or effective medicines, caring for sick family members happened almost entirely at home. For many families, the evening was also the only part of the day when they could simply observe one another without the constant pressure of labor. During daylight hours, everyone often worked in different places. Men might spend the day in fields, forests, workshops, or docks. Women balanced cooking, spinning, washing, childcare, gardening, and countless older children frequently worked alongside adults, while younger ones stayed close to home. Evening reunited the household beneath a single roof, and even though everyone remained busy, there was a comforting sense that the day's challenges had finally come to an end. Faces illuminated by candlelight looked softer than they had beneath the bright afternoon sun, and conversations unfolded at a slower pace. The furniture inside an ordinary 18th century home was usually simple but carefully maintained. A sturdy wooden table occupied the center of the main room because nearly every evening activity revolved around it. Meals were eaten there, clothing was repaired upon it, bread was kneaded across its surface, letters were written when paper was available, and children practiced writing their first letters if they were fortunate enough to receive an education. Benches were more common than individual chairs in poorer households, allowing several people to sit together. Every scratch, burn mark, and stain on the furniture reflected years of daily use, silently recording family life across generations. The walls themselves often appeared darker than modern homes. Smoke from fireplaces and candles gradually blackened ceilings and wooden beams over many years. In houses with thatched roofs, tiny bits of dust occasionally drifted downward as the roof settled. Decorations were limited. A family Bible, a simple wooden cross, a few ceramic plates displayed on shelves, dried herbs hanging from rafters, or perhaps a treasured clock if the family could afford one, were enough to make the home feel complete. Comfort came not from decoration but from familiarity. Animals frequently remained much closer to people than they do today. Cats wandered freely through the house hunting mice that threatened precious grain supplies. Dogs slept beside the fireplace or near the entrance, alert to unfamiliar sounds outside. In poorer rural homes during harsh winters, smaller livestock might even be sheltered in adjoining spaces to protect them from freezing temperatures. Their occasional movements, breathing, and quiet sounds blended naturally into the nighttime atmosphere. Fire demanded constant respect. Every family understood stories of neighbors who had lost everything overnight because of a single spark. Chimneys sometimes became clogged with soot, increasing the danger of chimney fires. A candle knocked over by a curious child or careless movement could ignite straw, cloth, or wooden furniture within moments. Before everyone retired, someone always checked that candles had been extinguished properly and that nothing flammable rested too close to the hearth. This final inspection became as routine as locking the door. If someone had travelled during the day, the evening meal often became the time to hear detailed accounts of distant places. Travel in the 18th century was slow, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. Roads were muddy, uneven, and sometimes almost impassable after heavy rain. Bridges could be unreliable, and inns varied greatly in quality. Therefore, stories brought home by travellers fascinated everyone. They described unfamiliar towns, strange customs, unusual foods, impressive churches, crowded markets, military movements or rumours spreading through neighbouring regions. In homes where few people travelled far from their birthplace, these conversations offered a rare glimpse into the wider world. Craftsmanship frequently continued long after sunset. Shoemakers stitched leather by candlelight. Blacksmiths sometimes performed small finishing tasks beside the fading glow of their forge, and carpenters carefully shaped wooden tools for the following day's work. Women spun thread using spinning wheels, whose gentle whirring became one of the familiar evening sounds heard across countless villages. The repetitive motion required patience, but little conversation, allowing stories to flow naturally while hands remained occupied. For families living near rivers or coastlines, evenings carried their own unique routines. Fishermen repaired torn nets, untangled ropes, sharpened hooks, and inspected boats before darkness completely settled. Salt left by seawater slowly damaged equipment, making constant maintenance essential. The smell of fish mixed with smoke from fireplaces, creating an atmosphere instantly recognizable to anyone living in maritime communities. Weather signs observed during sunset often determined whether boats would leave before dawn or remain safely ashore. People were deeply aware of the changing moon, because it affected nearly every aspect of life. A bright full moon transformed the countryside, making nighttime travel somewhat easier and reducing dependence on lanterns. Farmers often planned certain activities around moonlight, while travelers appreciated roads that became visible beneath its pale glow. On moonless nights, however, darkness could become almost absolute. Outside the small circle of candlelight, familiar paths disappeared, and even short journeys between neighbouring homes required caution. The sounds of insects filled many summer evenings. Crickets chirped steadily from nearby fields, frogs called from ponds, and countless unseen creatures created a constant background chorus. These sounds became so ordinary that most people hardly noticed them unless they suddenly stopped. Silence itself could be unsettling, because it sometimes suggested that a predator or unfamiliar disturbance had frightened nearby wildlife. In towns and small cities evening, life remained slightly more active than in isolated villages. Taverns welcomed customers looking for food, drink, conversation, or news. Apprentices finishing long workdays sometimes gathered briefly before returning to their employers' homes. Bakers prepared dough long before sunrise, meaning their evening schedules differed from many others. Night watchmen patrolled streets carrying lanterns and staffs, calling out the hours and watching for fires or suspicious activity. Their voices drifting through quiet streets reassured sleeping residents that someone remained awake. For wealthier households, evenings looked somewhat different, though they still depended upon candles and fireplaces. Families with greater means enjoyed brighter rooms because they could afford larger quantities of beeswax candles. Musical instruments such as harpsichords or violins provided entertainment. Guests might arrive for lengthy dinners, card games, dancing, or discussions of politics, literature, and philosophy. Servants quietly maintained fires, cleared dishes, and prepared bedrooms while their employers socialized. Yet even wealthy families respected the limitations imposed by darkness. Candlelight remained expensive, and bedtime generally arrived much earlier than it does today. Ordinary people often reflected upon the weather before sleeping because tomorrow's livelihood depended heavily upon it. Farmers listened carefully to the wind, hoping for gentle rain rather than destructive storms. Millers prayed for enough flowing water to power their wheels. Sailors wondered whether changing winds would allow safe voyages. Every household depended directly upon nature in ways that modern life has largely forgotten. The final moments before sleep were remarkably peaceful, compared to modern evenings filled with constant stimulation. There were no glowing notifications demanding attention, no late night broadcasts, and no endless streams of information. Instead, darkness gradually encouraged stillness. The fire settled into glowing embers, conversations faded into whispers, and one by one, each member of the household disappeared behind bed curtains or beneath heavy blankets. Many people spent a few quiet minutes reflecting on the events of the day. They remembered successful harvests, worried about unpaid debts, thought about relatives living far away, or offered silent prayers for protection through the night. Parents looked in on sleeping children, ensuring blankets had not slipped away during the cold. Elderly family members often slept lightly, waking whenever the fire shifted or an unfamiliar noise echoed outside. Even dreams held greater importance than they do for many people today. Throughout the 18th century, dreams were sometimes believed to contain warnings, messages from God, or signs about future events. A particularly vivid dream might become the topic of breakfast conversation the following morning, with family members debating its possible meaning. Local traditions often assigned symbolic interpretations to animals, weather, or people appearing in dreams. Outside, The village itself slowly disappeared into darkness. Only an occasional candle flickered behind distant windows. Church towers stood silently against the night sky, their outlines visible beneath the moon. Smoke rose gently from hundreds of chimneys before blending into the cool evening air. Fields rested after a long day of work, while horses, cattle, and sheep settled quietly until dawn. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, answered by another hidden among the trees. For someone from the 21st century, the greatest surprise might not be the lack of electricity or modern conveniences, but the extraordinary calm. Evening in an ordinary home during the 1700s unfolded without urgency. Every action had its place. Every object served a purpose, and every family member contributed to the household in some way. The hours stretched deeper into the night. The house itself seemed to settle. Wooden beams that had expanded in the warmth of the day slowly contracted as the temperature dropped, producing quiet creaks that echoed through the rooms. Floors made from thick wooden planks occasionally groaned beneath their own weight, and walls gave off soft cracking sounds that modern people might mistake for someone walking through the house. To an 18th century family, these noises were completely ordinary. Children who were frightened by unfamiliar sounds were often reassured that it was simply the house settling down for the night. Although local folklore sometimes offered far more imaginative explanations, the air indoors gradually cooled despite the glowing fire. Large fireplaces sent much of their heat directly up the chimney, leaving only those sitting nearest to the hearth truly comfortable. Family members often wrapped themselves in wool blankets or heavy cloaks while remaining awake. Wool was especially valued because it continued to provide warmth even when slightly damp. Linen clothing, though comfortable during warmer months, offered much less protection against chilly evening air. The contrast between the warmth beside the fire and the cold, only a few steps away, could be surprisingly dramatic. Candles burned unevenly throughout the evening, demanding occasional attention. If the wick grew too long, the flame became smoky and unstable. Someone used small metal scissors or a simple trimming tool to shorten the wick carefully, helping the candle burn more cleanly. Melted tallow sometimes dripped down the sides, hardening into pale ridges before reaching the candle holder. Nothing was wasted. Even these leftover bits of hardened fat could later be melted down and reused when making new candles. In many households, women kept baskets containing unfinished sewing projects beside their chairs. A stocking missing a heel, a shirt requiring fresh stitching around the collar, or a blanket needing reinforcement might occupy several evenings before being completed. There was little urgency to finish everything in one sitting, because such work formed part of the daily rhythm of life. Stitch by stitch, garments that might otherwise have been discarded continued serving the family for many additional years. Men often examined the tools they depended upon every day. A loose axe head, a cracked hammer handle, or a dull knife could make tomorrow's work more difficult or even dangerous. Using files, whetstones, and simple hand tools, they carefully restored each item. Many families owned only a small number of tools, making proper maintenance essential. Replacing broken equipment was expensive and sometimes impossible without traveling considerable distances. Children who struggled to stay awake frequently rested against parents or grandparents before finally being carried to bed. Younger siblings often shared sleeping spaces, whispering quietly beneath blankets until sleep overtook them. Older children sometimes continued listening to conversations from nearby rooms, pretending to be asleep while secretly absorbing stories and adult discussions that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The concept of privacy differed greatly from what most people expect today. Entire families often lived, ate, worked, and slept within just one or two rooms. Personal space was limited, and nearly every activity happened in view of others. Secrets were difficult to keep because daily life unfolded collectively. This closeness occasionally caused disagreements, but it also created strong family bonds born from constant shared experience. During particularly cold evenings, frost sometimes crept across the inside edges of window panes, creating delicate patterns that looked almost like leaves or feathers. Children occasionally traced these icy designs with curious fingers before the warmth of the room slowly melted them away. Condensation gathered where warm breath met cold glass, briefly clouding the view outside before disappearing again. Many people spent part of the evening preparing materials for tomorrow's work. Farmers braided ropes, repaired baskets used during harvest, or bundled firewood close to the door for easy access before sunrise. Bakers measured flour, blacksmiths arranged iron bars near their forge, and weavers organized threads according to color and thickness. These small preparations saved valuable daylight hours the following morning when every minute of sunlight mattered. Books remained uncommon possessions for ordinary families, making every page precious. When reading occurred, it happened slowly. Each sentence was spoken clearly, so everyone gathered around could hear. Children learned unfamiliar words simply by listening repeatedly to adults reading aloud. Stories from religious texts, collections of moral lessons, or popular chapbooks circulated among neighbors, passing from one household to another until the pages became worn from years of careful use. The scent of herbs often drifted gently through many homes. Bundles of rosemary, thyme, lavender, sage, mint, or chamomile hung drying from ceiling beams, releasing subtle fragrances whenever warm air from the fireplace reached them. These herbs flavored meals, freshened rooms, and served as ingredients for simple home remedies. Some families believed certain herbs offered protection against illness or misfortune, giving them both practical and symbolic value. Outside the windows, darkness transformed familiar landscapes into mysterious silhouettes. Trees that appeared welcoming during daylight could seem almost human beneath moonlight, their branches twisting into unusual shapes. Mist rising from nearby rivers or fields drifted silently across the countryside, softening fences, roads, and distant buildings until they almost disappeared. Travelers, caught outdoors after sunset, often relied upon memory more than sight to find their way home. If snow covered the ground during winter, evenings became strangely brighter. Moonlight reflected from fresh snow illuminated roads, rooftops, and fields with a pale silver glow. Entire villages appeared transformed beneath this natural light. Footsteps produced crisp, crunching sounds, and every breath formed small clouds that lingered briefly before vanishing into the cold air. Families sometimes paused beside windows, simply to admire the quiet beauty of a snowy night. Rain created a very different atmosphere. Water drummed steadily upon roofs, overflowed from gutters, and splashed into muddy paths outside. Wind occasionally forced smoke back into the room through the chimney, causing eyes to water until the draft corrected itself. Wet cloaks and boots hung near the fire, filling the room with the earthy smell of damp leather and soaked wool gradually drying through the evening. Many ordinary people owned very few personal possessions. A carved wooden spoon passed down from parents, a favorite blanket, a well-made pair of boots, or a carefully maintained pocket knife might represent someone's most treasured belongings. These items were treated with remarkable care because replacing them required significant expense or labor. Evening often provided time to clean, polish, oil, or repair these valued possessions, so they would continue serving for years to come. For elderly family members, evenings sometimes became moments of quiet reflection. Sitting close to the fire, they remembered childhoods that had unfolded decades earlier, under many of the same routines. They recalled unusually harsh winters, abundant harvests, weddings celebrated in nearby churches, neighbours long since buried, and children who had grown into adults with families of their own. Their memories connected multiple generations living beneath the same roof, reminding younger listeners that today's ordinary evening would eventually become tomorrow's history. Despite the hardships of 18th century life, laughter still filled many homes. Someone might tell an amusing story about a stubborn mule refusing to move, a goose chasing visitors around the yard, or an embarrassing mistake made during market day. Children giggled at exaggerated impressions. Adults smiled at familiar jokes, and even the oldest family members occasionally laughed until tears formed in their eyes. Humour required no wealth, no expensive equipment, and no special preparation. It remained one of the simplest comforts available after a long day of hard work. As midnight approached, the last visible glow inside the fireplace faded from bright orange to deep red. The room that had seemed warm and lively only an hour earlier gradually surrendered to silence. The occasional snap of cooling wood broke the stillness before even those sounds disappeared. Outside, stars continued their slow journey across the sky, unnoticed by the sleeping family below. Within a few short hours, the eastern horizon would begin to brighten once again. Roosters would announce the coming dawn, and the familiar cycle of work, meals, conversation, and evening rest would begin anew, just as it had for countless ordinary households throughout the 1700s. Not every evening in the 1700s was peaceful. Sometimes a family ended the day carrying the emotional weight of disappointing news. A harvest might have failed because of too much rain. A cow could have become sick. A horse might have gone lame, or an important payment might still be owed before the next market. Unlike today, there were very few safety nets for ordinary people. A single setback could affect an entire family for months. Yet, even in difficult times, the evening meal was often treated as a moment to gather together, discuss possible solutions, and encourage one another before another day of work began at sunrise. Many homes kept small storage chests or wooden cupboards that were opened during the evening to retrieve carefully protected valuables. These might include family documents, marriage records, a few silver coins, treasured letters, sewing needles, or a carefully folded piece of fine cloth reserved for special occasions. Such possessions represented years of savings and were protected with great care. Once they had been used or inspected, they were locked away again before everyone went to bed. Ordinary evenings also reflected the changing seasons through food. In early autumn, the smell of freshly harvested apples might fill the house as family members peeled, sliced, and dried them for winter storage. During late summer, bunches of onions and garlic hung from rafters, while beans were shelled into baskets by hand. In colder months, families relied increasingly on preserved foods that had been prepared during warmer weather. Every evening reminded people that the success of one season determined comfort during the next. If someone in the household possessed a particular skill, evenings became an opportunity to practice it. A skilled woodcarver might patiently shape decorative patterns into furniture. Someone talented at embroidery could create surprisingly detailed designs using only candlelight and remarkable patience. Others practiced handwriting using quills dipped into homemade ink, knowing that good penmanship could open opportunities in business or government service. These quiet hours allowed talents to grow slowly over many years. Neighbours occasionally exchanged small acts of kindness during the evening. Someone who had baked extra bread might carry a loaf next door. Another family might lend a tool needed for tomorrow's work, or bring fresh milk to an elderly couple unable to keep livestock themselves. These simple exchanges strengthened communities where cooperation often meant the difference between hardship and survival. Most people understood that one day they too might need help from those living nearby. the fireplace itself constantly demanded attention. Ashes had to be arranged carefully so enough heat remained beneath them to preserve glowing embers until morning. Losing the household fire overnight meant someone might need to borrow hot coals from a neighbor at dawn, or spend valuable time starting a completely new fire using flint and steel or other fire-making methods. For this reason, preserving the fire became one of the final responsibilities before sleep. Even the family clock, if they were fortunate enough to own one, played an important role in the evening. Grandfather clocks and smaller long-case clocks ticked steadily through otherwise quiet rooms. Their slow rhythm became part of the background of family life. Every hour announced by the bell reminded people how quickly another day had passed. For households without clocks, church bells ringing across the village often served the same purpose, their sound carrying surprisingly far through cool evening air. Many people believed the evening was the best time to reflect upon their behavior during the day. Religious teachings encouraged individuals to examine their conscience before sleeping. Had they spoken harshly to a neighbor? Had they fulfilled their responsibilities honestly? Had they shown gratitude for their blessings? These moments of quiet self-reflection formed an important part of daily life for many families, regardless of wealth. A mother often prepared the youngest children for bed by telling simple stories or singing gentle lullabies that had been passed through generations. These songs rarely had known authors because they belonged to the community itself. Their melodies changed slightly over time, as each generation added its own variations. Some lullabies warned children not to wander into forests or near rivers, while others simply described peaceful sheep, singing birds, or stars shining above the countryside. The night sky fascinated many people, because it remained one of the clearest sights available after sunset. Without electric lights washing out the heavens, thousands of stars filled the sky with astonishing brightness. People recognized familiar constellations and used them to estimate the season or direction. Farmers, sailors, shepherds, and travelers all depended in different ways upon the stars. Children learned their names while standing outside beside parents during calm evenings, pointing upward as stories connected each constellation to ancient myths or religious traditions. Some evenings ended with unexpected excitement. A messenger might arrive carrying urgent news from another village. Church bells could ring outside their usual schedule, signaling a fire, an important announcement, or an emergency requiring the community to gather. Dogs barking repeatedly sometimes alerted families to strangers approaching the area. Because news traveled slowly, unexpected visitors often brought information that had been weeks in reaching the village. Winter storms occasionally trapped families indoors for several days. During these long evenings, firewood supplies were carefully rationed. Parents reminded children not to leave doors open longer than necessary, because precious warmth escaped quickly. Snow piled against windows, making the world outside seem distant and silent. Yet these same storms often created memorable evenings, with families spending hours telling stories, playing simple games, or listening to grandparents recall winters even harsher than the present one. There were evenings when celebrations replaced ordinary routines. Birthdays were rarely celebrated with elaborate parties among ordinary families, but weddings, harvest festivals, religious holidays, and successful harvests brought neighbors together. Homes filled with additional voices, shared meals, homemade music, dancing, and laughter that continued much later than usual. Candles burned longer on such nights despite their cost, because special occasions justified the extra expense. Even silence had different meanings depending on the household. In one home, silence reflected contentment after a satisfying meal. In another, it revealed worry about approaching winter or poor crops. Children learned to recognize these moods without anyone speaking directly about them. The atmosphere around the fireplace often communicated as much as words themselves. As bedtime approached, parents frequently reminded children about the responsibilities awaiting them after sunrise. Someone would fetch water from the well, another would gather eggs before breakfast. Older boys might help harness horses, while girls prepared ingredients for the morning meal. Although these responsibilities varied greatly depending on the family's occupation and local customs, everyone understood that tomorrow's work began long before the sun fully rose. During particularly clear nights, moonlight streamed through small windows and stretched across wooden floors in pale silver rectangles. If clouds drifted across the moon, those patterns slowly shifted through the room without making a sound. Anyone awake during these quiet hours might watch the changing light, while listening to the gentle breathing of sleeping family members nearby. Insects occasionally buzzed around the final candle, circling endlessly until the flame disappeared. Moths, attracted by the light, fluttered softly against walls or ceilings. Tiny beetles, hidden within wooden beams, continued their slow chewing, producing faint sounds almost impossible to notice during the busy hours of daylight. At night, however, every small noise seemed magnified by the surrounding stillness. Before closing their eyes, many people quietly hoped for an uneventful night. They hoped the roof would withstand the wind, the livestock would remain healthy, no thieves would approach the house, no illness would worsen before morning, and no fire would break out while everyone slept. These concerns were ordinary parts of life, accepted rather than feared constantly. Morning itself represented success, because another night had passed safely. Looking back from the modern world, an evening inside an ordinary home in the 1700s may appear simple, even slow, yet beneath that simplicity lay countless routines that kept a family alive. Every candle trimmed, every log placed upon the fire, every garment carefully repaired, every loaf of bread prepared, every story shared, and every prayer whispered contributed to a way of life built upon patience, cooperation, and resilience. The evening was never merely the end of the day. It was the bridge between one day's labour and the next, a precious stretch of hours when ordinary people found warmth, companionship, hope, and comfort before once again greeting the dawn. There were evenings when the weather was so calm that the only movement outside came from the slow drifting of smoke rising from chimneys across the village. Looking through a small window, someone might see tiny points of candlelight glowing inside neighbouring homes, each one representing another family ending their day in much the same way. Although every household faced its own worries, there was comfort in knowing that everyone nearby shared similar routines. Across the countryside, hundreds of fireplaces crackled at nearly the same hour. Families finished their suppers, children grew sleepy, and candles slowly burned lower together. For craftsmen living in towns, the evening often marked the moment when apprentices finally relaxed after long hours of work. During the day, they had followed strict instructions from masters, learning trades such as carpentry, blacksmithing, tailoring, shoemaking, or printing. After supper, there was sometimes a brief opportunity to talk freely, exchange jokes, or quietly practice techniques they hoped would one day make them skilled enough to become masters themselves. These conversations helped preserve trade secrets and practical knowledge that rarely appeared in written books. The smell of bread baking late into the evening was familiar in many neighbourhoods. Some families preferred preparing dough at night, so it could rise while everyone slept. Others visited community ovens or local bakers early the next morning, carrying dough prepared the previous evening. Fresh bread represented one of life's simplest pleasures, and its comforting aroma drifting through a home often signalled that tomorrow would begin with a satisfying breakfast. Many households carefully counted their remaining candles before bedtime. Candle making required time, animal fat, or expensive beeswax, so families planned their use wisely. If only a few candles remained before the next opportunity to make or purchase more, evenings became noticeably darker. People relied more heavily on the fireplace, finishing work earlier and retiring to bed sooner to conserve light. In this way, even something as ordinary as candle supplies influenced the daily rhythm of life. Ordinary homes also contained countless handmade objects that carried family history. A wooden spoon might have been carved by a grandfather decades earlier. A blanket may have been woven before a couple married. A sturdy chair could have served 3 generations, each leaving small marks from daily use. Evening light often revealed these signs of age: the polished surface where countless hands had rested, the worn edge of a table rubbed smooth by years of meals, or the patched cushion repaired so many times that no one remembered its original appearance. If someone had recently returned from military service or distant seasonal work, evenings became opportunities to reconnect with family life. Children who had grown taller during months apart eagerly asked questions about unfamiliar places. Wives and husbands discussed changes that had occurred while separated. Parents listened carefully as sons or daughters described towns, rivers, mountains, or cities they had never seen. Since travel was uncommon for many ordinary people, these conversations expanded everyone's understanding of the wider world. Sometimes elderly relatives quietly taught practical wisdom that had been tested over decades. They explained how to judge tomorrow's weather by observing the color of the sunset, how certain birds behaved before heavy rain, or how particular winds usually signaled changing seasons. They described which herbs eased stomach pains, which trees produced the hottest firewood, and how to preserve food through long winters. Such lessons often occurred naturally during evening conversations rather than formal instruction, allowing younger generations to absorb knowledge without even realizing they were learning. Homes in the 1700s were rarely perfectly quiet, because small maintenance tasks continued until bedtime. Someone tightened a loose door hinge, replaced a broken peg in a stool, rewove part of a basket, or repaired a cracked clay pot using techniques passed down through generations. Throwing useful objects away was almost unthinkable when repairs remained possible. Every saved item represented money and labor that could instead be devoted to other necessities. For mothers with newborn babies, evenings followed a very different rhythm. Infants did not sleep according to convenient schedules, and mothers frequently woke several times during the night to feed, comfort, or change them. Older siblings often learned to sleep through these interruptions because they occurred so regularly. Fathers sometimes rose as well to tend the fire or fetch water, especially during cold weather when maintaining warmth for a newborn became especially important. During harvest season, exhaustion reached its greatest intensity. Entire families worked from sunrise until fading daylight, gathering crops before changing weather could damage them. Evening meals during these weeks were often quieter, because everyone was simply too tired for lengthy conversations. Hands stained with soil, clothing carrying the scent of freshly cut grain, and aching muscles reminded everyone that each successful harvest determined whether the coming winter would be comfortable or difficult. There were also evenings filled with anticipation. A wedding might be only days away. A son could soon begin an apprenticeship in another town. A daughter might prepare to leave home after marriage. Market day approached, bringing opportunities to sell goods, purchase supplies, and hear the latest news. These expectations added excitement to otherwise ordinary evenings, giving families pleasant topics to discuss while finishing their nightly work. Illness, however, could instantly change the atmosphere of a household. If someone developed a fever, every conversation became quieter. Herbal teas were prepared, cool cloths placed upon foreheads, and prayers offered beside the fire. Since medical knowledge remained limited, family members relied heavily upon traditional remedies and careful nursing. Long nights beside the bedside of a sick child or elderly parent were common experiences remembered for years afterward. The rhythm of the seasons could almost be measured by evening activities. Spring evenings often involved repairing fences, sharpening tools, and preparing seeds for planting. Summer brought preserving fruits and vegetables before they spoiled. Autumn filled homes with the work of drying herbs, storing grain, and preparing meat for winter. Winter evenings emphasized spinning, weaving, sewing, carving, and storytelling, while storms raged outside. Every season shaped household life in its own distinctive way. Even after everyone had gone to bed, the house never became completely still. The fire continued glowing quietly beneath its covering of ashes. A cat might wander through the room, searching for mice. Wind slipped gently beneath doors or around shutters. Rain tapped steadily upon the roof. Somewhere outside, horses shifted in the stable, cows breathed softly in the barn, or an owl called from the edge of the forest. These sounds formed the familiar soundtrack of nighttime, so familiar that many people found complete silence far more unsettling. If someone awoke during the middle of the night, as many people naturally did, they often found the house transformed. The lively room, filled with conversation only hours earlier, now lay in near darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of dying embers. Moonlight filtered through small windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The air felt cooler. Someone might quietly add another small piece of wood to the fire before returning to bed, taking care not to wake the rest of the household. Morning preparations quietly began long before sunrise. Clothing needed for the next day was laid out carefully. Boots were placed near the door. Buckets waited ready to be carried to the well. Tools rested where they could be reached immediately after breakfast. In this way, the evening never truly belonged only to the present day. It constantly prepared for the next one. Looking through the eyes of an ordinary family in the 1700s, the evening was not a time to escape life, but to maintain it. Every action, no matter how small, supported the household's survival. Sharing a meal strengthened family bonds. Repairing clothing saved valuable resources. Tending the fire ensured warmth until morning. Passing on stories preserved memories that would otherwise disappear. Offering prayers reflected hope in an uncertain world. Even the simple act of sitting quietly beside loved ones after a demanding day carried deep meaning. Today, many evenings pass surrounded by electric lights, constant entertainment, and endless information. Yet inside a normal home of the 1700s, evening unfolded at the pace of a burning candle. As the flames slowly shortened, conversations softened, work gradually came to an end, and darkness gently encouraged rest. There was no rush, no glowing screen demanding attention, and no noise beyond the crackle of the hearth and the voices of family. In that quiet world, where tomorrow depended upon today's preparation, and every ordinary task carried real importance, the evening offered something precious that people across the centuries would immediately recognize, a chance to gather together before another sunrise called them back to work once again. As the evening wore on, the fire often became the center of everyone's attention, without anyone consciously deciding it should. People naturally turned their chairs toward its warmth, watching glowing logs collapse into bright embers that pulsed gently beneath layers of ash. Every now and then, a pocket of sap trapped inside the wood burst with a sharp pop, sending tiny sparks upward before disappearing into the chimney. Children were usually reminded not to sit too close, yet they remained fascinated by the dancing flames, sometimes imagining castles, animals, or faces hidden within the shifting patterns of light. The pace of conversation changed as the night deepened. Early in the evening, people spoke about practical matters: how much grain remained in storage, whether the roof needed repairs, what tasks awaited tomorrow, or who would travel to the market later in the week. As fatigue settled in, those conversations became more thoughtful. Older family members reminisced about years gone by, comparing the present harvest to one decades earlier, or recalling winters so severe that rivers froze solid enough for carts to cross. Younger listeners often heard these stories so many times that they could almost recite them from memory. Yet they listened anyway, because the stories were as much a part of family life as the furniture surrounding them. Many ordinary homes contained little in the way of decoration, but every object carried purpose. A row of wooden pegs near the door held hats, cloaks, and lanterns ready for the next journey outside. Earthenware jugs lined shelves beside carefully stacked wooden bowls. Iron pots hung from hooks near the fireplace, their blackened bottoms showing years of daily cooking over open flames. Copper pans, if a family was fortunate enough to own them, reflected the flickering firelight with a warm golden glow. Even the simplest kitchen looked alive in candlelight, as shadows stretched and shifted across every surface. The evening also brought opportunities for quiet observation. Someone might notice how much a child had grown over the past year, simply by watching them reach for a shelf that had once been too high. Parents often realized new responsibilities could soon be entrusted to older children, while grandparents quietly admired the next generation learning skills they themselves had practiced since childhood. Life's gradual changes became most visible during these peaceful hours, when there was finally time to notice them. Outside the house, roads became nearly empty after dark. Travellers hurried to reach inns or familiar homes before night, fully settled because walking unfamiliar paths in darkness was slow and sometimes dangerous. Wagons rarely moved unless absolutely necessary. The sounds of wheels rattling over rough roads became increasingly rare as the evening progressed, leaving villages wrapped in remarkable stillness. If footsteps were heard outside late at night, people often paused to listen carefully before opening a door. On especially clear evenings, the cool air carried distant sounds much farther than during the day. A dog barking in another village, the faint ringing of a church bell several miles away, or the rhythmic clatter of a distant watermill sometimes drifted across fields with surprising clarity. These familiar sounds reassured people that life continued beyond the boundaries of their own homes, even though darkness hid everything from view. In homes where several generations lived together, responsibilities naturally shifted throughout the evening. Grandparents might entertain younger children, while parents completed chores. Older brothers and sisters helped prepare sleeping areas, folded blankets, or fetched extra firewood from nearby stacks before darkness made the task more difficult. Every member of the household, regardless of age, usually contributed something to the smooth running of the evening. The smell of smoke became stronger as fires settled lower. Chimneys of the 18th century were far less efficient than modern ones, and a thin haze often lingered near ceilings. Clothing absorbed this scent so thoroughly that travellers could often identify rural families simply by the faint aroma of wood smoke clinging to cloaks and blankets. It was such a familiar part of life that most people scarcely noticed it unless they spent time away from home. Simple household remedies were frequently prepared during the evening. Herbal mixtures might be steeped for sore throats, poultices assembled for aching joints, or dried flowers stored in cloth bags to freshen bedding. Knowledge of these remedies varied from family to family, but nearly every household relied upon plants gathered during warmer months. Shelves filled with carefully labelled bundles of herbs represented years of accumulated practical experience. The evening was also when tools for spinning and weaving were most often heard. The steady hum of a spinning wheel created a calming rhythm that blended with quiet conversation. Women who had used these tools since childhood worked almost automatically, their hands moving with practiced precision, while their minds remained free to tell stories, answer children's questions, or discuss tomorrow's plans. Producing enough thread for clothing required extraordinary patience, making every finished garment even more valuable. Sometimes unexpected guests sought shelter after sunset because darkness made further travel unsafe. Hospitality was deeply rooted in many communities, and strangers were often offered warmth by the fire, a bowl of stew, and a place to rest until morning, if circumstances allowed. In return, travellers frequently shared fascinating news from distant towns, reports of unusual weather, changing prices in markets, royal announcements, or rumours of events unfolding far beyond the local village. For families who seldom travelled, these visitors brought the outside world directly into their homes. The final candle of the evening became almost symbolic. As it burned lower, people instinctively began finishing whatever task remained in their hands. The last stitches were sewn into a garment. The final pages of a book were read aloud. The remaining embers were arranged carefully beneath fresh ashes, and chairs were quietly returned to their places. No announcement was necessary. The shortening candle silently reminded everyone that the day had reached its natural conclusion. When children finally climbed into bed, they often slept beneath quilts pieced together from scraps of older clothing. Every square of fabric told part of the family's history: a father's worn work shirt, a mother's faded apron, or pieces of blankets that had become too thin for regular use. These patchwork quilts preserved memories as well as warmth, surrounding children with the practical legacy of previous generations. Even dreams were shaped by everyday life. Farmers dreamed of abundant harvests or sudden storms. Sailors imagined calm seas or dangerous waves. Craftsmen saw unfinished projects continuing in their sleep. While children dreamed about fairs, festivals, or adventures, inspired by stories heard beside the fire. The boundaries between daily work and nightly imagination were often remarkably thin. Long before dawn, some family members naturally stirred during the quiet hours between first and second sleep. Without electric lights, there was little temptation to remain fully awake. A person might whisper a short prayer, check that the fire still held enough warmth, listen briefly to the wind outside, and then return beneath heavy blankets. These peaceful moments of wakefulness felt entirely ordinary rather than unusual. As another night passed, the house quietly guarded everything the family depended upon: their food stores, clothing, tools, memories, hopes, and one another. Within its timber walls, ordinary people faced a world that could be unpredictable and often difficult. Yet each evening offered the same reassuring routine. The fire was tended, the meal was shared, stories were told, prayers were spoken, and the family rested together beneath the same roof. Generation after generation repeated these familiar patterns, not because they resisted change, but because those simple rituals had proven, over countless years, to be the surest way to end one day and prepare faithfully for the next. As darkness settled completely over the countryside, the outside world seemed to shrink. During the day, fields stretched endlessly toward distant hills, roads connected neighbouring villages, and people moved constantly between farms, churches, markets, and workshops. At night, however, all of that disappeared beyond the reach of a single candle. The family home became a small island of warmth, surrounded by an immense sea of darkness. Stepping outside after the door had been closed often felt like entering another world entirely, where only the moon, the stars, and the occasional lantern offered any guidance. The evening also reminded people how dependent they were upon nature. If rain had fallen steadily all day, boots and cloaks were placed near the hearth to dry, filling the room with the earthy smell of wet leather and damp wool. If strong winds had blown across the countryside, someone might inspect the roof one last time from the doorway, listening for loose shingles or thatch shifting overhead. Every change in weather carried practical consequences, and the evening provided the first opportunity to assess whether the household had escaped the day's conditions without damage. For children, evenings were often filled with curiosity. They asked endless questions while adults worked. Why did the moon change shape? Why did some stars seem brighter than others? Why did the fire sometimes burn blue instead of orange? Parents answered using the knowledge available to them, blending observation with local traditions, religious beliefs, and stories that had been passed down through generations. Some explanations were surprisingly accurate, while others reflected centuries of folklore rather than scientific understanding. The glow from a single candle could transform ordinary objects into something mysterious. A coat hanging beside the door became a tall figure when seen from the corner of a child's eye. Tree branches outside the window swayed slowly, casting moving shadows across the walls that seemed almost alive. It was easy to understand why so many old stories about spirits, mysterious visitors, or creatures wandering after sunset found such willing audiences. The human imagination needed very little encouragement when surrounded by darkness and flickering light. Older brothers and sisters sometimes entertained younger children with harmless riddles or guessing games before bedtime. They challenged one another to identify objects hidden inside cloth bags by touch alone, or to recognize neighbors simply from the sound of approaching footsteps outside. Such simple amusements required no money and no equipment beyond everyday household items. Yet they filled many evenings with cheerful laughter. Every member of the household developed an intimate awareness of familiar sounds. They could identify which floorboard creaked near the fireplace, which cupboard door squeaked when opened too quickly, and exactly how the wind sounded when blowing from the north instead of the west. These tiny details became part of everyday life. If one familiar sound suddenly changed, people noticed immediately, because their homes were places they knew almost as well as their own hands. Sometimes after supper, someone quietly stepped outside for a few moments before going to bed. The cool night air felt refreshing after hours spent beside a smoky fire. Looking upward revealed a breathtaking sky crowded with stars from horizon to horizon. The Milky Way stretched overhead with astonishing clarity, appearing almost like a pale river flowing across the heavens, without electric lights dimming the sky. Many people probably saw more stars in a single evening than many modern city dwellers see in an entire year. During harvest time, barns remained busy even after sunset. Families continued sorting grain, hanging herbs to dry, or organizing vegetables inside cool storage spaces while there was still enough candlelight to work safely. The satisfaction of seeing shelves gradually fill with preserved food brought enormous peace of mind. Every basket of apples, every sack of grain, and every jar of preserved vegetables represented security against the uncertain months ahead. The evening also marked a pause in the endless cycle of noise created by daily labor. During daylight hours, villages echoed with hammering from blacksmiths, the rhythmic thud of axes splitting wood, the creaking of wagon wheels, livestock calling from fields, and workers shouting instructions across busy farms. As darkness spread, those sounds faded one by one until only nature remained. Crickets replaced hammers, owls replaced merchants, and the crackling fire became the loudest sound inside many homes. Some evenings were spent preparing gifts for important occasions. A father might carve a small wooden toy for his child without revealing the surprise. A mother embroidered initials onto a handkerchief, intended as a wedding gift. Brothers quietly repaired tools they intended to give one another before the next planting season. Since manufactured goods were expensive, handmade gifts carried tremendous emotional value, because they represented both time and affection. People also spent quiet moments caring for items that could not simply be replaced. Leather boots were rubbed with animal fat or oil to prevent them from cracking. Iron tools received a light coating of grease to reduce rust. Wooden handles were smoothed with small knives or sand to remove splinters. Even baskets woven from willow or reeds were inspected for broken strands before they became unusable. Such careful maintenance allowed ordinary possessions to last for decades. Not every family owned a mirror, and those who did often possessed only a small one. Evening grooming therefore relied more upon touch than appearance. Hair was combed carefully to remove tangles, hats were brushed free of dust, and faces were washed as thoroughly as available water allowed. Personal cleanliness remained important, even though daily bathing was uncommon due to the effort required to heat sufficient water. As parents tucked children into bed, they often reminded them of lessons learned that day. A child who had shown kindness toward a neighbor might receive quiet praise. Another who had neglected responsibilities could be gently corrected before sleep. Evening became a natural time for teaching character, because the day's events were still fresh in everyone's memory. These conversations helped shape values long before formal schooling reached many ordinary families. In wealthier homes, servants experienced evenings differently from their employers. While the family enjoyed conversation beside brightly lit fireplaces, servants remained busy washing dishes, cleaning cooking utensils, carrying water, preparing bedrooms, polishing shoes, and ensuring fires were safe before retiring themselves. Their work frequently continued long after everyone else had gone upstairs, making their evenings considerably shorter and more demanding. There were nights when the moon disappeared entirely behind thick clouds. On such evenings, stepping beyond the doorway meant entering almost complete darkness. Even familiar paths became difficult to follow without carrying a lantern. The absence of moonlight encouraged most people to remain indoors unless absolutely necessary. Travelers delayed journeys, neighbors postponed visits, and villages became unusually quiet until dawn returned. The smell of fresh straw spread through bedrooms whenever old bedding was replaced. While wealthier families could afford feather mattresses, many ordinary people slept upon straw, filled ticks that required regular changing to remain comfortable. Replacing the straw often became an evening chore because it was easier to complete after the day's heavier work had finished. Children sometimes laughed as fresh straw crackled beneath them while settling into bed. The final ritual before sleep often involved one last glance around the room. Was the door securely barred? Were the animals safely enclosed? Had the candle been extinguished? Was enough water ready for the morning? Had the fire been banked properly beneath ashes? These questions became second nature. After years of repetition, completing each task brought quiet reassurance that the household was prepared for whatever the night might bring. If everything remained peaceful, the family drifted gradually into silence. Breathing slowed, the fire glowed softly beneath its blanket of ash, and the house rested beneath the same stars that had watched over countless generations before them. No one knew what tomorrow's sunrise would bring. It might bring abundant harvests, unexpected visitors, joyful celebrations, difficult labor, or troubling news. But for one precious stretch of hours gathered safely within sturdy walls, warmed by a faithful fire, and surrounded by those they loved most, an ordinary family in the 1700s could simply rest, confident that they had done everything possible to prepare for another day in a world where every evening was both an ending and a quiet beginning. As the last conversations faded, many adults simply sat in thoughtful silence for a while. They did not always feel the need to fill every moment with words. After a day that had begun before sunrise and continued with nearly constant physical labor, the opportunity to sit quietly beside a warm fire was a luxury in itself. They watched the flames rise and fall without hurry, listening to the familiar sounds of home. For modern people, silence can sometimes feel uncomfortable, but for an ordinary family in the 18th century, it often felt peaceful, almost comforting. It was the sound of another day successfully completed. The family dog usually sensed this changing mood before anyone else. After spending the evening alert to every knock at the door or unusual sound outside, it curled into a familiar place near the fireplace or beneath the table. Cats, having spent hours patrolling for mice, often climbed onto benches or settled beside sleeping children where the remaining warmth lingered. Animals were not merely companions, but working members of the household, protecting food stores and providing an early warning whenever strangers approached. The shadows cast by candlelight constantly changed as people moved around the room. A person crossing between the fire and the wall briefly became a giant silhouette stretching almost to the ceiling. Chairs seemed larger than they really were, while shelves filled with jars and bowls appeared almost theatrical under the flickering light. Nothing remained completely still because the flames themselves never stopped moving. This living quality of candlelight gave every evening its own unique atmosphere. Many people spent the final moments before bed checking tomorrow's weather as best they could. They opened the door briefly, feeling the temperature with experienced hands rather than relying on instruments. They noticed whether the air carried moisture, whether fog had begun forming over nearby fields, or whether the stars shone with unusual sharpness. The direction of the wind mattered greatly. Experienced farmers believed certain winds brought rain, while others promised clear skies. These observations were discussed quietly, because tomorrow's work depended so heavily upon conditions that could not be controlled. The household's supply of firewood was another constant concern. During colder months, someone often counted the remaining stack before sleeping. A large pile brought reassurance that the family would remain warm through winter, while a shrinking stack reminded everyone that more trees would soon need to be cut, split, carried home, and stacked carefully under shelter. Firewood represented warmth, cooked food, dry clothing, and even light. Running out during winter could become a genuine emergency. Children occasionally asked parents to tell one more story before bedtime. These were rarely long adventures with complicated plots. Instead, they often involved clever foxes, hard-working farmers, generous strangers, stubborn donkeys, wise kings, or simple moral lessons that encouraged honesty, kindness, patience, and courage. Since books were uncommon, children memorized these tales through repetition. Years later, they would tell the same stories to their own children beside another fireplace. The kitchen gradually transformed as bedtime approached. Cooking pots were scrubbed as clean as possible, using hot water, sand, or ashes. Wooden spoons dried beside the hearth. Bread was wrapped carefully to prevent it from becoming stale overnight. Milk was placed in the coolest part of the house, while leftovers were covered with cloth to discourage insects and mice. Nothing was left carelessly because food represented hard-earned labor that could not easily be replaced. In homes where spinning wheels stood beside the fireplace, the room felt strangely different once they stopped turning. After hours of their steady rhythm, the sudden silence seemed almost noticeable. The same was true for looms, hand mills, or other tools used throughout the evening. When the day's final task ended, the absence of sound reminded everyone that rest had finally arrived. For elderly people who found sleep difficult, evenings sometimes stretched much longer than they did for younger family members. They remained awake watching embers glow softly beneath the ashes while remembering people who were no longer alive, parents, siblings, childhood friends, or neighbors whose voices had once filled the same room. These quiet reflections connected the present household with generations stretching backward through time. The smell inside the home changed as the fire settled lower. Strong scents of cooking gradually disappeared, replaced by the gentle aroma of cooling wood, beeswax or tallow drying herbs, and old timber warmed by the hearth throughout the day. Even without opening their eyes, family members could recognize home by its familiar mixture of smells. Some evenings coincided with important dates on the village calendar. The night before market day often brought excitement, because families prepared goods they hoped to sell: fresh eggs, woven baskets, homemade candles, butter, cheese, vegetables, or carved wooden tools. Everything was packed carefully before bed so departure could happen quickly after sunrise. Children sometimes struggled to fall asleep, eager for the chance to visit a bustling market filled with unfamiliar faces and interesting sights. Before retiring, parents frequently walked quietly through the house, making sure every child remained comfortably covered. Heavy wool blankets occasionally slipped away as children turned in their sleep, exposing them to cold night air. A gentle hand pulled the blanket back into place before parents returned silently to their own beds, careful not to wake anyone. Outside, village life had almost completely disappeared from view. Roads that bustled with carts and livestock only hours earlier now lay empty beneath the moon. Smoke from dozens of chimneys drifted slowly upward before disappearing into the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, a horse stamped inside a stable while cattle shifted gently in their stalls. These quiet reminders of life beyond the walls reassured people that they were part of a larger community even while sleeping. During especially cold nights, frost crept slowly across windows in delicate patterns, unlike any artist could paint. Children waking briefly sometimes admired these icy flowers glowing pale blue beneath moonlight before snuggling deeper beneath blankets. Adults knew such beautiful sights also meant another freezing morning awaited them, bringing extra work before breakfast just to warm the house again. There were evenings when someone quietly sang while finishing the last chore. Not a performance for an audience, but a familiar tune remembered since childhood. The song blended naturally with the crackling fire and the soft whistle of wind outside. Sometimes another family member joined in for a verse or two, before silence returned once more. Music existed not only during celebrations, but also within these ordinary moments of everyday life. As the final embers dimmed, the house seemed almost to breathe. The roof creaked gently, beams settled with quiet pops, and cooling iron pots made faint clicking sounds. Every old house possessed its own nighttime voice, known so well by the family that unfamiliar noises immediately drew attention. Over the years, people learnt exactly which sounds belonged to the building and which suggested something unusual outside. For countless ordinary families throughout the 1700s, evening was never simply the period between sunset and sleep. It was the heart of home life, when work slowed enough for people to notice one another again. It was when practical skills were passed from parents to children, when family stories remained alive through spoken words, when clothing was repaired instead of discarded, when tomorrow's hopes quietly replaced today's worries, and when the warmth of a single fire gathered everyone into one shared circle of light against the vast darkness beyond the walls. When the last candle was finally pinched out, darkness filled the room almost instantly. There was no faint glow from streetlights, no electronic clocks shining from bedside tables, and no distant lights from neighbouring buildings bright enough to enter through the windows. The night became truly dark in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Yet within that darkness, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by familiar voices now replaced by peaceful breathing, and sheltered by a home built through years of patient labour, an ordinary family found something they valued deeply: the quiet certainty that, for another night at least, they were together, they were safe, and with the coming dawn they would begin the simple, demanding, and deeply connected rhythm of life all over again. Not every evening followed exactly the same pattern, but almost every household shared one important feeling as darkness deepened: a growing awareness that the world beyond their walls had become uncertain until sunrise. Roads that felt ordinary during the day seemed unfamiliar after sunset. Even people who had walked the same path for years preferred not to travel, unless absolutely necessary. A journey that took 20 minutes in daylight could take much longer at night, as travelers moved cautiously to avoid ditches, tree roots, loose stones, or muddy patches hidden by darkness. For that reason, families appreciated reaching home before the last traces of daylight disappeared. The evening meal often lingered longer than the food itself, once bowls had been emptied and bread broken into its final pieces. People remained seated around the table simply because it was the warmest and brightest place in the house. Nobody hurried away. There was nowhere else they urgently needed to be, and no endless stream of distractions waiting in another room. The simple pleasure of sitting together became part of the meal itself. Children frequently played quiet games while adults continued their work. They arranged pebbles into patterns on the floor, stacked wooden blocks carved by parents, or invented stories using handmade dolls, stuffed with scraps of cloth. Older children sometimes taught younger siblings songs they had learned from neighbors or at church, ensuring those melodies continued into another generation. Every evening quietly preserved traditions that had no written record. If the family owned a small garden, someone might step outside briefly before bed to check that the gate remained closed. Rabbits, deer, or wandering livestock could destroy vegetables overnight if they found a way inside. During summer, the scent of herbs and flowers lingered in the cool evening air, while in autumn, the smell of fallen leaves mixed with damp earth. Even these short walks became familiar rituals repeated, almost without thought. Many homes stored drinking water in large ceramic jugs or wooden barrels. Before everyone slept, someone checked that enough remained for breakfast and morning chores. Fetching water required effort, especially during winter when wells sometimes froze or paths became slippery. A simple task like filling a bucket demanded planning, because convenience could never be taken for granted. The evening also gave people time to notice the smallest changes within their homes. A loose roof tile discovered after a windy day, a cracked window shutter, or a tiny leak beginning near the chimney could all become tomorrow's first repair. Because homes represented years of labor, constant maintenance prevented small problems from becoming serious ones. Nearly every family developed the habit of quietly observing their surroundings while the pace of life slowed. Grandparents often became the unofficial historians of the household. Around the fire, they described how the village had looked when they were children, which houses had once stood where empty fields now stretched, and how certain families had arrived generations earlier. They remembered old customs that younger people were already beginning to forget. Their memories linked living family members with ancestors, whose names survived only through spoken stories. Sometimes the evening brought moments of simple wonder. A shooting star streaked across the sky while someone stepped outside to secure the door. The northern wind carried the distant sound of church bells farther than usual. Fireflies drifted above nearby fields during warm summer nights, appearing almost like tiny floating candles. These natural sights required no planning or expense, yet they remained vivid memories because people had the time to notice them. There were evenings when neighbors gathered unexpectedly because someone possessed exciting news. Perhaps a relative had safely returned from a distant city, a child had been born earlier that day, or word had spread that the harvest looked especially promising. Such news travelled from house to house through conversation, rather than newspapers or telephones. Before long, several families might be sitting together around a single fireplace, sharing stories until the candles burned low. Ordinary households also spent evenings preserving food for the future. Strings of mushrooms gathered from nearby woods were hung to dry above the hearth. Herbs collected during the afternoon released their fragrance as warm air rose toward the ceiling. Apples were sliced carefully before being placed on drying racks. Every preserved ingredient represented security against the uncertainty of winter, making these quiet tasks deeply satisfying despite their repetitive nature. The family clock, if there was one, seemed louder after children had gone to bed. Each slow tick echoed gently through the room, marking time with patient regularity. In homes without clocks, people judged the hour by the position of the moon, or simply by how tired they felt. Life was governed less by precise minutes than by natural rhythms: sunrise, sunset, hunger, seasons, and weather. The fire itself demanded a surprising amount of skill. Different kinds of wood burned differently. Oak produced long-lasting heat, while pine ignited quickly, but burned faster and created more sparks. Experienced adults knew exactly when to add another log and when to let the fire settle. They understood how to arrange wood so enough embers survived beneath the ashes until morning. These practical skills were learned through years of observation rather than formal instruction. Some children fell asleep before reaching their beds. Parents gently lifted them from benches beside the fireplace, carrying them upstairs or across the room without waking them. The warmth of the hearth, combined with the day's excitement and physical activity, often proved stronger than any determination to stay awake a little longer. Half asleep, children barely remembered being tucked beneath blankets. Rainy evenings possessed their own comforting atmosphere. Water drummed steadily against roofs, while the family remained safely indoors. Damp cloaks steamed gently beside the fire, and boots left muddy marks near the entrance before being cleaned. Although storms complicated tomorrow's work, there was satisfaction in hearing the weather from inside, a dry, warm home built to withstand it. Even the simplest household routines reflected remarkable patience. A torn sleeve was not repaired in minutes, but through careful hand stitching that required steady concentration. A broken stool was mended piece by piece rather than replaced. A dull knife regained its edge slowly against a whetstone. Modern conveniences had not yet shortened these tasks, so evenings naturally accommodated work requiring time instead of speed. Before sleep finally overtook them, many adults looked once more at the faces of their children resting peacefully beneath blankets. Candlelight softened every feature, making the room feel calm despite whatever worries tomorrow might bring. Harvests could fail. Illness could appear unexpectedly. Storms might damage crops, and money was often scarce. Yet for these few quiet hours, none of those concerns could be solved. All that remained was the warmth of the fire, the comfort of familiar voices now replaced by gentle breathing, and the hope that another sunrise would arrive safely. In many ways, an ordinary evening inside a home during the 1700s was built upon countless small acts of care. Someone trimmed the candle so others could see. Someone repaired clothing so it would last another season. Someone checked the animals before bed. Someone carried water, banked the fire, comforted a frightened child, told a familiar story, offered a quiet prayer, or simply sat beside a loved one after a long day's labor. None of these actions seemed extraordinary at the time. Yet, together, they created the steady rhythm of home life that sustained families through ordinary days and extraordinary hardships alike. As the final ember disappeared beneath a blanket of pale grey ash, complete darkness settled over the house. Beyond the thick wooden door, the world waited silently beneath the stars. Inside, every heartbeat, every slow breath, and every sleeping dream belonged to people whose evenings were shaped not by clocks or technology, but by the timeless cycle of daylight, firelight, family, and rest, a rhythm that had guided human lives for countless generations, long before the modern world began to glow. As one season gave way to another, families noticed that the feeling of the evening changed in subtle ways that had nothing to do with the clock. In early spring, cool air drifted through tiny gaps around doors, and windows carrying the fresh scent of damp soil and newly growing grass. Birds settled into nearby trees with their final songs of the day, and the promise of another growing season filled many homes with quiet optimism. By contrast, Autumn evenings carried the unmistakable smell of fallen leaves, harvested grain, and distant bonfires, where farmers burned unwanted brush. Even before stepping outside, people could often identify the season simply by breathing the air that entered the house. Children who had spent the entire day outdoors frequently brought bits of the countryside home with them. Their boots carried dried mud from village paths. Their sleeves held tiny seeds caught in the fabric, and their pockets sometimes concealed interesting stones, feathers, or acorns collected during the afternoon. Before bedtime, parents gently reminded them to empty their pockets, so these little treasures would not be forgotten beneath blankets or mixed into the washing. Such discoveries often became topics of conversation around the evening fire, especially when younger children proudly explained where each object had been found. The kitchen remained active long after supper had ended. Someone kneaded dough for tomorrow's bread, while another carefully skimmed fat from broth that had simmered throughout the day. Earthenware jars were rearranged on shelves, dried herbs were checked for signs of moisture, and bundles of onions hanging from the rafters were inspected to ensure none had begun to spoil. Every household understood that careful attention to food prevented waste, and waste was something few ordinary families could afford. There were evenings when the entire family worked together on a single project. Perhaps a new blanket needed stuffing with fresh wool, or sacks required mending before the grain harvest began. Sometimes several people peeled apples together while talking, each pair of hands making the work lighter for everyone else. These shared tasks transformed necessary labor into valuable family time, allowing conversation to continue naturally while work steadily progressed. The sounds from outside changed with remarkable predictability. During summer, insects created an almost constant chorus that continued until late into the night. Frogs called from ponds hidden beyond the fields, while distant livestock occasionally answered one another across dark pastures. Winter evenings were much quieter. Snow absorbed sound so effectively that entire villages seemed wrapped in silence. A single horse walking down the road, or a church bell ringing in the distance, could be heard with surprising clarity. Parents often used the evening to teach practical lessons that children would carry throughout their lives. A father might show his son how to judge the sharpness of a knife without touching the blade, while a mother explained how to recognize when bread dough had risen enough, simply by pressing it gently with a finger. These skills were rarely written down. They survived because patient adults demonstrated them repeatedly during countless ordinary evenings. Visitors rarely arrived empty-handed. A neighbor might bring a basket of fresh eggs, a small wheel of cheese, or a loaf of bread in exchange for help received earlier in the week. In return, they were offered warmth by the fire and perhaps a cup of warm drink, while conversation flowed easily between households that depended upon one another throughout the year. These visits strengthened friendships that often lasted entire lifetimes. The family's clothing gradually told the story of their lives. A patched elbow reminded everyone of a winter spent cutting firewood. A carefully repaired boot recalled the long walk to a distant market. A faded apron carried stains from years of baking and cooking. Evening repairs ensured these familiar garments continued serving faithfully despite constant use. Few people viewed old clothing as unfashionable. Instead, maintained garments reflected careful stewardship of valuable resources. Many children fell asleep while listening to adult conversations they barely understood. Discussions about taxes, crop prices, village disputes, or distant political events drifted gently through the room as sleepy eyes slowly closed. Although they missed much of what was said, these nightly conversations gradually introduced young minds to the responsibilities awaiting adulthood. The fire provided more than warmth. It also served as the household's clock in a way. People learned to estimate how much of the evening remained simply by observing the condition of the burning logs. Freshly added wood suggested many hours before bedtime. while glowing embers signaled that the household would soon grow quiet. Without consciously realizing it, families organized their routines around the life of the fire itself. Even after everyone appeared asleep, someone occasionally stirred to listen for unusual sounds. A sudden gust of wind against the shutters, a restless horse in the stable, or the barking of dogs somewhere beyond the village could briefly awaken a light sleeper. Most of the time there was nothing to worry about, and after a few moments of listening, the comforting silence encouraged sleep to return once again. The moon held special importance during evening life. Its changing phases influenced more than just the amount of available light. Many people believed certain farming activities, planting schedules, and even household tasks were best performed during particular phases of the moon. Whether based upon observation or tradition, these beliefs shaped countless ordinary decisions made throughout the year. Sometimes, while everyone sat quietly beside the fire, someone absent from the family occupied their thoughts. A son apprenticed in another town, a daughter recently married into a neighboring village, or a relative serving far from home, might be remembered with both pride and concern. Letters travelled slowly, and weeks or months could pass without news. Evening became the natural time to wonder how loved ones were faring, and to hope they remained healthy and safe. The ceiling beams, darkened by decades of smoke, silently witnessed generations of family life. Weddings had been celebrated beneath them. Babies had taken their first steps across the same floor. Elderly relatives had shared their final stories beside the same fireplace. Every evening added another small chapter to the home's long history, even though nobody living there thought of it in those terms. As midnight approached, temperatures often dropped noticeably. The warmth that had filled the room after supper slowly faded unless more wood was added. Blankets became increasingly welcome, and even the family cat sought the warmest remaining spot near the hearth. Breath sometimes became visible indoors during the coldest winter nights, reminding everyone that dawn would likely bring frost. The simple act of extinguishing the last candle marked one of the most dramatic changes in the entire day. One moment the room glowed with soft golden light, revealing familiar faces and well-used furniture. The next moment everything disappeared into darkness almost instantly. Eyes required several moments to adjust before the faint orange glow beneath the ashes became visible once more. That transition happened every single evening, yet it never became completely ordinary. For people living in the 18th century, home represented far more than shelter from rain or cold. It was the place where knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next, where children learned the habits that would shape the rest of their lives, where ordinary joys softened the hardships of physical labor, and where every evening reminded the family that despite uncertainty beyond their walls, they belonged together. In the gentle glow of firelight, surrounded by familiar voices, worn wooden furniture, handmade possessions, and the comforting rhythm of well-practiced routines, an ordinary home became the safest place in a world that could often be unpredictable. And so, as another night settled peacefully over the countryside, one more family closed their shutters, banked their fire, whispered their final goodnights, and surrendered themselves to sleep, trusting that with the first light of dawn, the familiar rhythm of another day would begin again. As the hours quietly passed, the warmth inside the home created a gentle contrast with the cool darkness waiting beyond the walls. Anyone who briefly opened the door before bed immediately felt the difference. Cold air rushed into the room, causing candle flames to flicker wildly, and everyone sitting near the fire to glance toward the doorway. The scent of damp earth, fresh grass, rain, or snow entered for only a moment before the heavy wooden door was closed once again, restoring the comforting warmth that had taken hours to build. Many families measured prosperity not by luxury, but by simple signs of security visible every evening. A neatly stacked pile of firewood beside the house meant warmth through the coming weeks. Shelves filled with jars of preserved food promised that winter hunger would be less severe. A healthy horse resting quietly in the stable represented reliable transportation and valuable labor. A sturdy roof that remained dry during heavy rain was considered a blessing. These ordinary things, easily overlooked today, brought genuine peace of mind to people whose daily survival depended upon them. Children often developed favorite places within the house during the evening. One child might always choose the stool closest to the fireplace, while another curled up on a small woven rug beside the family dog. These spots became part of childhood itself, remembered decades later long after the house had changed or disappeared. The worn boards beneath those favorite seats gradually became smoother from years of use, silently recording the presence of generations. The evening was also when people repaired relationships as naturally as they repaired clothing. If harsh words had been spoken during the stress of a busy working day, apologies often came quietly before bedtime. Parents disliked allowing children to sleep while still upset, and neighbors who had disagreed over fences, livestock, or property boundaries sometimes settled their differences during calm evening conversations rather than allowing anger to continue into another day. The slower pace encouraged patience that daylight pressures sometimes interrupted. Many homes contained handmade baskets filled with scraps that modern people might consider worthless. Tiny pieces of cloth were saved for future patches. Short lengths of string were carefully coiled rather than discarded. Bent nails were straightened and reused. Small pieces of leather became repairs for shoes or harnesses. Nothing useful was casually thrown away because every object represented effort, materials, and time. Even the youngest children quickly learned that almost everything could serve another purpose. The sound of someone sharpening a knife against a whetstone became familiar during many evenings. The slow scraping echoed gently through the room while conversations continued without interruption. Sharp tools made tomorrow's work easier and safer, whether preparing food, carving wood, harvesting crops, or repairing fences. Maintaining equipment was considered just as important as using it well. Sometimes families discussed the coming seasons in great detail. During spring, they spoke hopefully about planting. During summer, they watched crops mature with cautious optimism. Autumn evenings focused on gathering every possible harvest before frost arrived. Winter conversations often centered on making supplies last until warmer weather returned. The entire year unfolded according to nature's calendar, and evening offered time to reflect upon where the household stood within that endless cycle. A quiet satisfaction often filled the room after particularly successful days. If hay had been gathered before rain arrived, if a healthy calf had been born, or if a difficult repair had finally been completed, the mood around the evening fire became noticeably lighter. Laughter came more easily, stories grew longer, and people lingered beside the hearth instead of hurrying to bed. Small victories carried enormous meaning, because they directly improved the family's future. On other evenings, silence revealed disappointment. Perhaps unexpected frost had damaged vegetables, a cartwheel had broken, or illness had prevented someone from working. Yet even then, families usually faced problems together rather than individually. They discussed possible solutions while seated around the same table where they had shared countless previous meals. The evening became a time for planning rather than despair. Ordinary household objects slowly acquired emotional importance through years of use. A cracked mug repaired several times remained someone's favorite cup because it had belonged to a parent or grandparent. A simple wooden rocking chair became associated with comforting babies, reading aloud, or resting after exhausting harvests. A woven blanket remembered countless winter evenings spent wrapped around tired shoulders beside the fire. The value of these possessions came not from expensive materials, but from the memories attached to them. The older members of the family often noticed changes that younger people overlooked. They observed that a child had begun speaking more confidently, that a teenager now carried themselves like an adult, or that parents themselves had grown more capable than they realized. Evening, with its slower pace and shared space, allowed these quiet observations to surface naturally through conversation. There were also moments when everyone simply listened, rain striking the roof with steady rhythm, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft breathing of sleeping children, or the crackling of oak logs in the fireplace required no explanation. These sounds became woven into daily life so completely that years later they remained among the strongest memories of childhood. For many people, the stars above carried practical as well as emotional meaning. Farmers noted the position of familiar constellations to judge the changing seasons. Travelers relied upon them when roads disappeared into darkness. Sailors far from shore trusted the same stars to guide them across unfamiliar waters. Looking upward during an evening in the 1700s connected ordinary people with something vast, dependable, and unchanged across generations. The final preparations for bed happened almost automatically. Shoes were placed where they could be found quickly before dawn. Work clothes were folded neatly or hung from wooden pegs. Water buckets stood ready for the morning. The poker rested beside the fireplace. Doors received one final check, and shutters remained tightly fastened against wind or unexpected visitors. These habits became so familiar that people often completed them while continuing quiet conversations. Even dreams reflected the concerns and hopes of everyday life. Farmers dreamed of healthy fields waving beneath gentle breezes. Bakers imagined perfectly risen loaves. Shepherds dreamed of strong lambs filling spring pastures. Children dreamed about village fairs, colourful ribbons, exciting stories, or adventures inspired by travellers' tales heard around the evening fire. Their dreams were shaped by a world much smaller than ours, yet no less vivid. As the house grew colder during the deepest hours of the night, family members instinctively pulled blankets closer. Straw mattresses rustled softly whenever someone turned over in their sleep. Bed curtains, where they existed, trapped precious warmth around sleepers. Somewhere beneath the fireplace ashes, a faint red glow still survived, patiently waiting to become tomorrow morning's fire. No one living through those evenings believed they were experiencing history. To them, these routines were simply life. Lighting candles, mending clothes, banking the fire, sharing stories, checking livestock, saying prayers, and preparing for another dawn seemed entirely ordinary. Yet together, these quiet evenings formed the foundation of family life for millions of people across Europe and beyond during the 18th century. If a modern visitor could step unnoticed into one of those homes, they might first notice what was missing: the absence of electric light, running water, heating systems, televisions, engines, telephones, and every familiar convenience of the modern age. But after sitting quietly for a while, another realization would gradually emerge. Despite all those missing comforts, the room would still feel unmistakably human. Parents would still smile at their children. Grandparents would still tell stories they had told many times before. Friends would still laugh over simple jokes. Someone would still worry about tomorrow, while another offered reassurance. A tired child would still fall asleep beside the fire, and loving hands would still carry them gently to bed. That may be the most remarkable thing about an ordinary evening inside a normal home in the 1700s. Although the tools, technology, and surroundings were vastly different from today, the emotions were deeply familiar. People sought warmth after a cold day, comfort after hard work, companionship after long hours apart, hope during uncertain times, and peaceful rest before facing tomorrow. The centuries have changed almost everything about the way homes look and function. But the quiet desire to gather with loved ones at the end of the day has remained one of the most enduring parts of being human. As bedtime drew closer, the pace of every movement naturally slowed. There was no sense of rushing to finish the day, because the darkness itself encouraged people to become calmer. Someone carefully folded a blanket over the back of a chair, another quietly placed a kettle nearer the fireplace for the morning, while another looked over tomorrow's basket of tools one final time. These small acts were performed so often that they became almost instinctive, passed from one generation to the next, without anyone formally teaching them. The oldest members of the household often claimed they could tell what tomorrow would bring simply by observing the evening. They watched how smoke rose from the chimney. If it climbed straight into the sky, they expected calm weather. If it drifted low across the ground, they prepared for rain or changing winds. They noticed how loudly insects sang, how active birds remained before sunset, and even how livestock behaved before entering their shelters. While these observations were not always correct, they reflected centuries of careful attention to the natural world. Many ordinary families kept small wooden boxes containing their sewing supplies. Inside were precious needles, carefully wrapped thread, spare buttons carved from bone or wood, small scissors, and bits of cloth too useful to discard. Losing a needle could mean searching the floor for several minutes by candlelight, because replacing it was not always easy. Children were warned never to play with these supplies, understanding from an early age that even tiny household objects carried real value. The evening was also when parents quietly observed their children's progress. A father noticed that his son could now lift a bucket that had once been too heavy. A mother smiled as her daughter completed stitches that had recently seemed impossible. Grandparents watched younger family members repeating habits they themselves had learned half a century earlier. Growth was measured not only by height, but by increasing responsibility and confidence. Some evenings were unusually lively because relatives from another village had arrived unexpectedly. Since travel took considerable effort, such visits were treasured. Extra stools were brought into the room, additional bread appeared on the table, and stories continued much longer than usual. Cousins who had not seen one another for months quickly resumed games as though no time had passed. Adults exchanged news that had taken weeks to travel from one place to another, discussing weddings, harvests, births, illnesses, and local events that shaped the lives of people spread across the countryside. The smell of the evening fire changed, depending on the wood being burned. Oak produced a rich, steady aroma that many people associated with winter comfort. Applewood released a sweeter fragrance, while pine filled the room with a sharper scent accompanied by occasional bursts of sparks. Families who spent their lives gathering and burning firewood could often identify different trees simply by smell long before seeing the logs themselves. Outside, village lanes became almost silent, except for the occasional footsteps of someone returning home late. A lantern moving slowly through the darkness immediately attracted attention, because it was one of the few visible lights beyond the windows. People sometimes paused beside the shutters, wondering which neighbour was still abroad at such a late hour before returning to their own conversations. Even household clocks, where they existed, rarely dictated life as strictly as they do today. Instead of living according to exact minutes, people followed habits shaped by daylight, weather, and the changing seasons. If tomorrow promised clear skies during harvest, everyone expected to rise especially early. If heavy rain prevented outdoor work, morning routines naturally adjusted. Evening planning reflected this flexible relationship with time. The fireplace itself seemed almost alive after years of constant use. Certain stones became polished from countless hands placing fresh logs upon the fire. Iron hooks, blackened by smoke, held kettles that had prepared thousands of meals. Children grew up recognizing every mark upon the hearth, just as they recognized the faces of family members gathered around it. The fireplace became not only the physical center of the house, but also the emotional one. Many ordinary evenings ended with someone quietly humming while finishing a final chore. The tune might be a harvest song remembered from childhood, a hymn heard at church, or a melody learned from parents long ago. Others rarely joined in, yet no one found the gentle music unusual. It blended naturally with the crackling fire and the whisper of wind outside, becoming another familiar sound of home. There were nights when frost formed so heavily that the world outside reflected moonlight almost as brightly as daytime. Snow-covered fields glowed softly beneath the stars, making fences, trees, and rooftops appear almost silver. Looking through a small window, children sometimes imagined the countryside transformed into another world, while remaining perfectly still beneath the cold sky. Families living near forests occasionally heard the distant calls of wild animals after sunset. Foxes barked sharply across open fields. Owls called from high branches. Deer moved cautiously through woodland undergrowth, snapping small twigs that echoed surprisingly far in the quiet night. These sounds reminded people that nature continued its own rhythm long after humans had gone to sleep. The simple act of blowing gently on a spoonful of hot soup before eating represented another small detail of evening life. Meals cooked over open fires often remained extremely hot, and families lingered over them without hurry. Steam curled upward into the candlelight, while conversation flowed naturally between mouthfuls. Nobody rushed because there were few competing demands once the day's work had been completed. Children often invented imaginary adventures while staring into the glowing embers. Bright red coals became castles, dragons, distant mountains, or magical kingdoms depending upon the child's imagination. Parents smiled knowingly because they had done exactly the same thing when they were young. Without realizing it, generations shared identical childhood experiences, separated by decades. Before sleep, some adults quietly thanked God for another safe day. Their prayers were often simple rather than elaborate. They expressed gratitude for food upon the table, healthy children sleeping nearby, successful work completed before sunset. And in a world filled with uncertainty, these moments of gratitude offered emotional comfort, regardless of material wealth. The family's belongings reflected years of careful craftsmanship. Wooden bowls bore the marks of thousands of meals. Iron pots had blackened through decades of cooking. Blankets showed careful patches added by loving hands, rather than signs of neglect. Every repaired object demonstrated respect for the labor required to create it in the first place. Even after everyone appeared asleep, the house retained a quiet sense of life. Embers glowed faintly beneath grey ashes. A kettle clicked softly as cooling metal contracted. The family cat shifted position beside the hearth. Wind brushed gently against shutters before moving on across the fields. Occasionally, a sleeper murmured indistinctly before settling once again into peaceful rest. By the final hours of the night, the house seemed suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. Yesterday's work had ended. Tomorrow's labour had not yet begun. And for a brief stretch of peaceful hours, the household simply existed in quiet stillness. These moments rarely found their way into official histories or written records, yet they formed the rhythm of everyday existence for countless ordinary people. Perhaps that is why evenings inside a normal home during the 1700s remain so fascinating. They remind us that history was not only shaped by kings, wars, explorers, and great discoveries. It was also built quietly inside humble homes where candles flickered against wooden walls, where parents comforted tired children, where neighbours shared bread and conversation, where old stories lived another night around the fire, and where ordinary families, through patience, hard work, and unwavering devotion to one another, created lives filled with warmth and meaning. Despite possessing very little by modern standards, every peaceful evening ended the same way. With the last ember fading, the final whisper of good night disappearing into darkness, and another generation falling asleep beneath the timeless protection of home.